I am your professor, Dr. Aubrey Underwood, and today it is my absolute pleasure to be talking to you about the era of Reconstruction. The era of Reconstruction has a lot of meaning for us in a number of ways. There is a contemporary impeachment trial going on that connects us to the time that the nation had, rather, its first impeachment of Andrew Johnson. Johnson and Trump, some have argued, have much in common, and we'll talk about that. The era of Reconstruction means a lot as we are in Atlanta. Atlanta is one of these places that is absolutely transformed by Reconstruction, and also sees the emergence of a Black middle class, emancipating themselves from slavery, which is something we will talk about as well, and the creation of the country's first HBCUs, including Atlanta University. So the era of Reconstruction really needs its own space within our course, and we're going to spend some time really delving into this as our module about Reconstruction lasts for 2 weeks. All right. So very briefly, I wanted to show you this slide right here, which shows you some of the men, African-American men, who are elected to represent Southern states following the Civil War. And we will come back and look at this particular political transformation. But before we get started, it's important to sort of have a quick recap about the Civil War, both how it was waged, why, and the mythology that often surrounds it. The American Civil War, in which Southern states seceded from the United States and declared themselves their own sovereign country, and the war to get those states back, was actually the U.S.'s third war over slavery. The War of 1812 between the United States and England, ostensibly also over commerce, very much involved the United States illegally bringing in enslaved Africans and violating international treaties against this, signed by the U.S. and England in around the early part of the 19th century. The U.S. breaking these treaties is one of the reasons for this war with England in 1812. In terms of the Mexican-American War, one of the causes of that war involved Americans who were also bringing in enslaved peoples into Mexico, where, again, slavery was illegal. So part of the reason to fight Mexico over the Texan territory, as well as 1/3 of what will become the United States and what was once Mexico, was to expand slavery. So that is going to bring us to the American Civil War, which breaks out in 1860, and like I mentioned previously, is fought over slavery. By the late 19th century, early 20th century, right, 1900s, there is a mythology that is being churned out by white academics and universities like Princeton, Harvard, that says that the American Civil War was not over slavery, a word that still wasn't used, really. It was pretty much known as America's peculiar institution. But the war wasn't over slavery at all. It was about states' rights, and for states to have more power than the federal government. That is one of the many mythologies that are circulated in American textbooks. Another involves sort of the nature of liberation from above. And although we do see the passage of specific laws, such as the 13th Amendment that abolishes slavery, 14th Amendment establishing citizenship rights, as well as the Emancipation Proclamation, these pieces of legislation were only part of the liberation of Black people in America. Liberation also came from within. A general strike of enslaved people that was going on in the years predating and during the war. W.E.B. Du Bois, who writes about this extensively in his 1936 book, Black Reconstruction in America, calls this self-emancipation. So you have one mythology that Lincoln emancipated Black people, and then you have what Du Bois speaks and writes about, which is more aligned with self-liberation, which are two very different things, and often and perhaps did overlap, but we were going to spend some time looking at what this means. All right. The other mythology that often comes with the topic of the Civil War and American slavery is that somehow American slavery was not horrific. This, of course, is certainly untrue, where the horrors of enslavement, from rape to having children torn away from you, certainly from the violence that was used to maintain this, the horrors of this should continue to shock and remind people just the cruelty of humans and how long it can continue and the ways in which it was justified. So just as we remember the horrors of the Holocaust, we also need to remember the horrors of the American institution of enslavement. In terms of the war itself, the war also stood out at the time as the bloodiest conflict in American history, with over 600,000, mostly young men, who were killed on the battlefield. This war also involved so many other aspects. It involves new technology. It involves the use of chemical warfare. It involves some women who dressed up as men in order to fight. It involves certainly Black militias who are fighting for their own liberation. So it has all of these components which make it such a fascinating war. We're not going to spend so much time on the battles, but rather focusing on the impact of the war and Reconstruction. But as I mentioned previously, W.E.B. Du Bois, in his book Black Reconstruction, again writes of self-emancipation guided by a general strike of enslaved people who saw themselves as having an opportunity to stop working and really emancipate themselves. And he writes this, of course, as he is a professor here at Atlanta University. So he has his evidence, and we're going to look at some of that evidence that he uses to support his ideas, as well as how he sort of demonstrates the tremendous change that happens in only 2 generations after the end of enslavement, or rather, actually just 1 generation after the end of enslavement, what Black America looked like. And we're going to look at that as well. All right. Excuse me. So the era of Reconstruction in the South has a number of particular components. We're going to look at what is known as the Freedmen's Bureau. This is a particular part of the federal government, a federal agency that is established to implement some of Reconstruction, and we're going to talk about that in just a minute. But what you see right here is a picture from a Freedmen's Bureau school, and of course Atlanta University was also funded by the same agency. You might be wondering who in the American government, the federal government, is championing the rights of African Americans, and it is radical Republicans, which were a group of Republicans from mostly the North who believe very much that not only an end to slavery was necessary, but full participatory citizenship rights. And this becomes a mechanism for full democracy. We have this moment in this particular time. Oh, this should be 1867. I'm sorry about that. The Reconstruction Act of 1867 that could reestablish America as a real equal society. That's the goal of these radical Republicans. And unfortunately, you're going to see that a newly appointed president, due to assassination, tries to derail those policies and actually works against that, leading him to be impeached, and again, providing this moment in history. Radical Republicans also believe they have to rebuild the framework of Southern culture, meaning they really have to address systemic racism. And that meant, again, providing full citizenship rights, but also taking land from white former Confederates, giving it to those who had formerly been enslaved. So there is a confiscation of land, and there is the belief that everything has to be reworked in Southern society in order for this to effectively have a real equal country. So those are some of the beliefs and ideas at play during Reconstruction. And here is another picture of the inside of the Freedmen's Bureau, and the camera is invented around the 1850s. So we now do have these images from the 1860s that we can look at and see what it would have looked like inside the schools. Buttressing some of these Reconstruction ideas are, of course, the federal legislation. Remember, right before the war breaks out in 1860, the Supreme Court ruled on this issue of freedom in a free state. Are Black people free in free states? And of course, according to the Supreme Court and the Dred Scott decision, they said no, that any person of dark skin, doesn't matter, free or slave state, is not considered a citizen of the United States and therefore has no rights and is not free. So one of the long-term causes of the war, of course, is this decision. And of course, it needing to be challenged and reversed. So federal legislation that's passed during the era of Reconstruction includes the 13th Amendment, which we'll get to in just a minute. Oh, excuse me. 14th Amendment, 15th Amendment, 14th Amendment, of course, offering citizenship rights, 15th Amendment guaranteeing the right to vote. Now, there's a couple ways you can think about this. I like to think of the Civil War as the fighting stops on the battlefield, but continues in every other way, right? So you have to ask yourself, how's the federal government going to enforce these laws? How's the federal government going to force Southern states to abide by these laws? And how long will they work to ensure that they're being protected? All great questions, all very much central to what happens next. So the 14th Amendment, of course, is a national definition of citizens because of birth in the country. There is the Equal Protection Clause, which becomes critical 100 years later in passing new civil rights legislation. There's the Due Process Clause. And of course, Confederate officials. What I also find interesting about the 14th Amendment is that it banned Confederate officials from national office. And again, this is something that Andrew Jackson is going to ignore. And as he is basically rebuilding the South in its previous image, in contrast to radical Republicans in Congress. 14th Amendment also says Confederate debt is repudiated. All right. The 15th Amendment in 1870, the 15th Amendment became law. It guaranteed African American men the right to vote. Of course, this very much angered women's activists and sort of grew this wedge in terms of white women and suffrage for civil rights of Black men and women. So this is something that continues to be an issue among activists for, ever since. One thing to also note about the 15th Amendment is that it also happens around the same time as the Enforcement Acts. And the Enforcement Acts basically made the Klan illegal. And this is something else that Johnson is going to work his way around. So the Enforcement Acts are radical Republicans' attempt to curb Klan violence and terror, and the use of these former Confederates who just a few years ago were fighting to keep slavery, tried to prevent them from becoming more violent and deadly. Johnson's also going to try to move around that as well. All right. So you might look at these radical Republicans as making a number of successes. And the Military Reconstruction Act basically said that the South is now going to be occupied by federal soldiers, and they made different zones and put a lot of soldiers there. So Atlanta would be an example of a city that's very much dominated by Union soldiers, and you see that reflected in the 21st century in the names of towns around Atlanta. Right, there's Union City. That obviously was a large post of soldiers. There is Old Federal Lake north of the city as well. That reflects this. But once you start paying attention, you see a lot of names of Union all over the city, and that is a reflection of that. All right. Command of the Army Act, again, that's also related to the need of making sure that the Army is in command by not a former Confederate, fearing other rebellions, of course. The Military Reconstruction Act, as I said, divided the South into these different military districts. And the thing to remember is, according to this act, all former Confederate states, so that's Tennessee, who seceded, of course, not those who didn't, but Tennessee, Georgia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Virginia, Alabama, Mississippi, Texas, Louisiana, they would have to ratify the 14th Amendment. So you cannot get back into the country unless you acknowledge these new rights. So again, this is what they are politicking now around, no longer having a war, but rather having a political battle over how this is going to play out. You can sort of see how states are starting to be readmitted into the Union. And we're going to come back to this in just a minute when I'm talking about Johnson. But here are sort of how and when they get back. All right. So what are the successes of this point in time? You certainly see the emergence of African American politicians. A number of men are elected to represent even former Southern states. So this is an incredible triumph and success. You also see a shift in power. You saw radical Republicans who are really using their political power to create a time of real equality. And this shift in power for radical Republicans does not last very long and is certainly going to be challenged. You also saw a shift in power for the South really losing power in the government for the first time in the country's history. Of course, you see the building of HBCUs, including Atlanta University and other African American schools. And these schools are going to educate not only this first generation, but certainly students up until today. And with that, right, you have the emergence of the Black middle class. You have the nation's first Black doctors, lawyers. And we're going to see, interestingly enough, what all this looks like. And if this looks familiar to you, it is. It's a photograph of 4 students on the steps at Atlanta University, right? And W.E.B. Du Bois puts this together in 1900 to show the world what this new generation of African Americans actually looked like. This is the graduating class of lawyers at Howard. These are a waiters union, considered one of the more prestigious sort of restaurant jobs that were around. And of course, they're unionized, meaning that they are aware of their stronger economic power rather than just sort of being individual workers. Portraits of everyday students. Right, and this is students in a biology class at Howard. And you also start to see the occupation of African Americans in Georgia. Obviously, the majority are in agricultural labor, but you also see those employed on the railway, carpenters, joiners, other types of labormen, merchants, painters, all the way down to even gardeners and florists, professors, teachers. So Du Bois is keeping track of this in his analytical work. He's also showing us, right, images of men in the military. He's also showing us how the demographics change over time. So we're going to get back to this, and you're actually going to look at this for a different assignment later in the course. All right. So just some images of what this black middle class actually looks like. Independent churches. We also see the proliferation and spreading of African American churches, political participation. But there is this Dunning-Knight myth that still clouds Reconstruction and this achievement. Again, these history books often ignore it or don't or treat it as something that isn't true, right? So even though we have all this evidence of this success, it is not an aspect of American history that is retold. And they also write about Reconstruction as an absolute failure, which is doesn't do much to help the image of African Americans in prevailing white culture. So there are a number of ramifications of this that will continue over time. Okay. You also, again, this is a map that's demonstrating black and white participation in political conventions. Failures of Reconstruction. So the discussion asks you to think about both the successes and failures. And one of the failures is certainly white supremacy. White supremacy is able to combat radical Republican objectives. White supremacy following Reconstruction is established in every way. So Reconstruction, a time where there is an attempt to make America equal, it's a failure. It does not achieve that objective. It brings the South in, it rebuilds the South, but it does not reshape Southern culture and social and legal practices, which is, again, what and economic practices, really, which is what radical Republicans said had to be done in order to effectively constitute change. Instead, you have something of what the Dunning-Knights, or what I call the cult of the glorious past, right? This is a celebration of Confederate soldiers, Confederate death, Confederate emblems. This is when we will see the proliferation of Confederate monuments across the South as they become ever present by the 1920s. You also see sort of a popularity of minstrelsy, right? This is white actors in blackface. It will remain the most popular form of American entertainment well into the 20th century. You also have many popular stereotypes of African American men and women that become nationally popular through songs, plays, and what will eventually become TV and film. Also playing for white audiences by white actors in blackface. And as I said before, you have a popular retelling of the states' rights narrative that becomes the dominant way most students learn about the Civil War well into the 20th century. Reconstruction will also see the beginning of a real legal challenge to prevent black enfranchisement. And we will talk about that, obviously, with the instatement of Jim Crow. The things that are coming are perhaps even more ominous. Individual Southern states are rewriting their constitutions, very much in violation of these federal amendments, trying to exclude black voters as much as possible. Economically, former plantations are becoming feudal lands or sharecropping lands where people are now tenant farmers and having to pay rent to stay on the land and farm for a landowner. Former plantation owners, now landowners, remarked to each other that this was actually more profitable for them. So why did they even fight the Civil War? Well, wow. what an admission. Excuse me. The Ku Klux Klan is born as the Democratic militia of the Democratic Southern Party. It conducted a reign of terror on African Americans who are voting, African Americans who were succeeding in this new economy, African Americans who had moved to places outside of what was considered white boundaries. African Americans who were certainly successful, as well as whites who were helping to achieve those goals. That's what the Klan focused on, and had a reign of terror and a variety of tactics, mostly violent, to try to achieve that. Here you see an example of the federal government failing to protect those that they came to protect. You also have in southern states, southern constitutions adopting vagrancy and loitering laws, which are just legal ways of arresting people standing around. And through this, you have something worse than slavery, which is industrial re-enslavement. The 13th Amendment says that prison labor is legal, and that is something that will continue to be practiced well into the 21st century. This splintered families, men and women, were placed in as prison laborers, with the state of Georgia having one of the longest history of prison laborers, as well as some of the most horrific conditions as well. This is also a form of disenfranchisement, obviously going in and out. Prison even now means you will not be able to vote in most states. Here you see that people in the South, those who were newly liberated, those who are living in a post-Civil War world, were abandoned by the federal government. And this is an argument as to why it became a failure. Reconstruction was considered a success by 1877, and many of the programs then defunded. We're going to stop here, and the next video will pick up on Lincoln's assassination and the impeachment.